So tonight we're going to take on two prominent neoliberals. The neoliberal way of looking at the world is simple, really, though they mask it as being very complex. The neoliberal believes not in a nation or its people, but rather sees everybody as what my wife likes to call interchangeable widgets. You'll often find the neo-lib having economic discussions where they pretend that all that matters is the dollar sign, and as long as the country has a lot of money being pumped into it, or the GDP growth is going wild, things are just peachy. Things aren't just peachy. The status quo sucks. The defenders of the status quo suck just as bad. Seemingly remarkably disconnected from the real world, the neoliberals incline to lie to you. They'll tell you out of one side of their mouth, they want maximum personal freedom, and out of the other side, tell you how much we need to limit freedom so you're allowed to have any at all. Myself and the missus take a different outlook. We balance responsibility and duty to family and nation along with God. A nation is simply put the lines where the culture and the government of one group of people ends and another begins. These people may be compatible and they may not be compatible, but what is a sure thing is that they have their own unique interests, concepts, values, and cultures. The neoliberal cosmopolitans are just elitists. They believe in a new form of borderless society, which actually goes against their own Enlightenment framework. As the nation state came from the Enlightenment framework, they would have us move back into dynasties, confederacies, and eventually empire. A worldview long ago abandoned as being unworkable every time it's tried. Make no mistake, what we're discussing here is imperialism masked under cosmopolitanism. I don't want empire. I want a strong central nation with a strong people whose value structures are shared, even if they do have some minor cultural differences. The world is not a confederacy or an empire, but a collection of nations with peoples who have their own destiny they share with their own countrymen. A value structure the neolibs would destroy along with the communists. We're here to defend that system tonight, but also to put globalism to the question. On a side note, my previous engagement with Destiny, I've since been totally vindicated on the immigration argument, and while I concede he argued it better than I did, I was still correct, and now we have absolute proof I was correct, and I'm just throwing that out there.
Wait, what? Can you refresh the people in chat that don't remember that argument? What was that about?
My viewpoint on that was that Democrats were essentially allowing the border to stay wide open so that they could win the election, and so that they could win pretty much every election going forward, and they were migrating people around to do that.
Jeez, that's I must have missed the vindication of that claim, but is it our turn?
Yeah, it's your turn.
Yeah, so I don't know, Bastet, why don't you go first, and then Destiny?
Okay, so I am. It's always fun to hear myself described as kind of a stateless cosmopolitan, a rootless cosmopolitan, as noted red fascist Joseph Stalin might have called me. But that's just not the way to describe it. That's just completely inaccurate, as anybody who's ever watched any of my content or seen any of it would be able to attest. And indeed, I absolutely believe in the United States as an institution, not just as some kind of organic cultural blood and soil creation, but as a political institution, a nation founded on a creed rather than on a set of ethno-religious characteristics, a creed that comes down to maximizing a lot of values that I believe in: personal liberty, personal freedom, on, and all the rest of it. And I think that because I believe in the values of this institution as expressed in our founding documents, our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, never perfectly realized, but every decade getting closer to being better realized. Because I believe in that institution, I believe in improving the nation, right, that supports that institution. I believe in better government, more effective government, pursuing equality before the law, rising prosperity so that people have better lives, can more accurately, can best achieve the goals they set out for themselves. And the reason that's important is that a nation is not something that love needs to be forced upon, right? People will organically find affection for their fellow countrymen, for the people that they live around, if they work together to build a better society, right? If they can work together under a democratic framework with a free economy, then there's no need for a state to force nationalism down upon them. They will develop an organic patriotism, a love of country that does not devolve into this excessive xenophobia that Big Papa fascist seems to be describing here. The problem, I think, that we get with a lot of these folks on the far right, is that they think that people are not capable of forming these sorts of attachments without a state forcing it upon them. And that's why he wants the state to force culture on people. That's why he's very insistent on this idea that culture starts and stops at borders, which, especially when applied to the United States, is ridiculous. Our culture is global in scope and encompasses much of the world these days. Beyond that, I think it's also important to note that the United States has been unique, perhaps among all the nations of the world, in how connected it has always been with the rest of the world through trade, through its involvement around the world, through immigration. So the idea that it could be some kind of blood and soil construct, some kind of isolationist nation, runs counter to all of its history and anything that could realistically be possible given the makeup of this country today. So I think that, it's a nice diversion to talk about neoliberalism, but at the end of the day, the nationalism that Big Papa Fascist wants for the United States is entirely alien to us. And the patriotism that a lot of good Americans actively believe in and support, the patriotism that I believe in, is something that arises when we have a functional country, when we do our part to make it the best we can. We don't need to use the state to force culture on people who otherwise apparently don't feel the need to be a part of it.
All right, Destiny.
Well, I mean, what is there left to say after Bastia's opening speech? I love the idea of people being able to sort themselves out as they see. Contrary to what Big Papa Fash says, I don't see people as interchangeable widgets. I think that view more closely aligns with somebody that thinks that you can prescribe one lifestyle, be it morally and politically, to an entire nation of people. I think that person is more likely to see people as interchangeable widgets than a neoliberal or a SOCDEM that's more likely to see people, choose to live in different areas, speak different languages, participate in culture as they see fit. I do believe in a strong economy. I think that an economy going well doesn't necessarily mean that all things are peachy, but I think that an economy that goes well does a lot of amazing things. Like, for instance, it allows people across the country to come together on websites and argue with each other on the internet in front of a bunch of other people that are living across the world, watching people argue with each other across the internet. I don't think the status quo sucks. I think we have a lot of problems today that we need to fix, but I mean, with new problems comes new potential solutions, and I look forward to see how we tackle those challenges going forward. I don't necessarily want a borderless society, but I mean, like, to some extent, we have to acknowledge we're already in that era, whether we want to believe that or not. We're on computers with parts that are made in different countries, that are manufactured and developed and researched by people from different countries and that are sold in different countries. Like, everything that we do today is kind of a globalized effort, whether we want to believe it or not. And I think pushing in that direction would be positive to do in the future.
All right, so we can open up the floor now.
All right. You can go ahead, Rach.
Well, I was just listening to Bastia out there. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
A little bit of an echo, but I don't know.
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay. I've got we don't usually use a setup up here where I am, so hopefully it's not too bad.
It's better.
What's that?
It's better now.
Okay. So I was listening to Bastiat's speech there, and I was thinking that he kind of did exactly what I thought he would do. Instead of really understanding what BPF was saying there, he kind of took the usual, you guys are xenophobes, racists, homophobes, whatever phobes, right? And that we want to force our worldview on other people, et cetera, et cetera. That's like the common trope that we deal with all the time when people don't actually listen to what we're saying or understand what we're saying. As far as you guys as liberals wanting, freedoms for people, wanting choice for people, I think that without national sovereignty, you don't have that. I don't see how, if you want a globalist system, how you're going to maintain those freedoms. We haven't had much success exporting our democratic ideals, our liberal ideals to the world. That was kind of a Bush doctrine that failed. We are not neocons, so the typical neocon arguments aren't going to work here. If you can't export these ideas to the world and spread them, how do you think that you're going to just import people from other parts of the world here and they're just going to suddenly see the light and step on the magic dirt and decide that they're Americans and they believe in liberalism and they believe in freedom and democracy? I think that's the part that you guys kind of just say, well, once they get here, it'll all work itself out, right? And that's the part that we don't agree with. We don't think you can just smush a bunch of people from all over the world together, and if everybody has a good job, everything else just kind of works itself out. We give them a pocket constitution and everyone's just on board. I think that's naive.
Okay, so if I might respond to a couple of those points. First of all, the globalist system, with the United States in particular, the United States I have no idea what risk the United States has of losing its sovereignty. The United States occasionally subjects itself to things like international arbitration or maybe an international court, but it does that of its own choosing. Nobody's forcing it to do so. Nobody could. And so if the United States is choosing to do that, it's doing that because it believes that there's some long-term interest for it to do so. Like back during the Cold War, the interest in these international institutions was to kind of leverage the strength of other countries to build a coalition against the Soviet Union. These international organizations would perhaps someday in the future, if fully fleshed out and developed, be a more affordable, safer, attractive alternative to, say, a world of a war between independent nations punctuated by espionage and coercion, all that kind of stuff. So you can see how a country would want that sort of stuff and nevertheless not be giving up its sovereignty, but rather choosing a better way to resolve its disputes. So that's one. Exporting democracy. President Bush definitely failed to export democracy to Iraq and Afghanistan. But the idea that the United States has historically failed to do that is just not true. The United States succeeded in setting up democracies in Italy, Germany, Japan, Yugoslavia, South Korea. And while it's, of course, not something that always works, it's also not something that is impossible or that has never worked. And speaking of Germany, you're talking about importing people who do not believe in democracy. If you take a look at a map of the United States with all the counties spread out by largest or kind of most prominent ethnic group by numbers by county, it's interesting to see just how half the counties in this country, the largest ethnic group, are Germans who came here in large part during the 19th century from an authoritarian country like Prussia or the other German states. There's no democracy of any sort in Central Europe at the time. These people who came here, they adopted these ideas in part because that's part of the reason they came here, because they couldn't find democracy and freedom in their own countries. That's not the entire reason. Of course, they primarily came here for economic opportunity. But people have been coming here from non-democratic nations for our entire history. I mean, there was a time where the United States was, apart from Britain, the only really democratic country in the world. So the idea that, it's just touching magic dirt. No, people go for democracy and go for, economic opportunity because that's a way that they have the ability to participate in society, right? You got to be here for a while before you start looking at autocracy as a more attractive option than what it is you left.
Yeah, I think it's 1/3. I think it's 1/3 of all Germans in the world live in the United States. Is that right, Bastiat? Looks like you got the figures right there.
I don't know the number. I just know that the huge number of American counties.
So that's nice that they live inside the United States, this bordered nation that we live in, that has borders that you want to get rid of, right?
No,
can we talk real quick, just so we're on like the same page? So because neither me nor Bastiat, or I don't know if Bastiat is, maybe I don't think either of us is arguing that like the entire world's population should live in the United States, right? There obviously needs to be some form of border control. When you say like borderless, what do you think that our position, or do we need to spell that out? Maybe we should talk about that.
Yeah, maybe you should spell it out.
All right. Okay. Well, I mentioned, I often talk about being for, quote, open borders immigration. I mean, what that means is effectively that if you wanted to come to the United States, you would have to be, subject to whatever checks for disease and goods and contraband and all the rest of it. But long story short, if the government didn't have a reason to keep you out, well, then you'd be able to get into the country.
Yeah, so people should be able to like sort themselves out economically as they see fit. Obviously, we're still doing like whatever the basic checks are. If you come over and you've had a history of like being part of the fucking Taliban or some shit, you're probably not going to make it. If you've got a ton of disease, you're probably not going to make it. There might be some sort of like minimum economic check. I know for a lot of other countries around the world, if you have like a certain amount of capital, they'll just let you like move there and become a citizen. I think in New Zealand, if you invest like $500K into a business, they'll just make you a citizen or shit like that. So I mean, like there could be like requirements like that, but basically the idea is that there exists some advantage in terms of getting like talented people or people willing to work into our country, and to set up arbitrary roadblocks based on like their skin color or religion or something, I think does a disservice to the native people that live here.
Okay, got it. So just to flesh this out more, so you're going to have a closed border where people are checked for diseases and checks are done on them and this kind of thing. That doesn't sound like an open border at all.
Well, technically, every border by definition is, if it's a border, it's closed and open in some way. Like our current border is open. Well, you might.
Yeah, I mean, it's open.
Like,
no, it's not
compared
open.
to what we
It's
have
not
now,
required
where
that you can't come in.
well,
There's laws
I mean, like,
specifically that say that you cannot come in unless you come the right way. So what we're asking is, if you're fleshing this out for us and you're saying, look, we're going to be doing all sorts of different checks on you to make sure that you're allowed to come into the country, I don't really see how that's too much different than what we have right now exactly.
well,
the
because
big
it depends.
difference is
Well,
with you, and it's like looking back at Ellis Island in the earlier part of the 20th century, for example, where you had to go through a process that maybe took about a week or something, but then that was pretty much the end of it. As opposed to now, where the process can take months or years before you can get into the United States legally. That's the difference, is to make it much easier.
and I think we need to be honest. I think it's a little bit absurd to think, there might be some people that argue, but the idea that we literally completely get rid of the border and anybody can wander in and out as they please, I mean, like, that's a pretty extremely stupid position to defend. I can't imagine that there are that many people that earnestly believe in that idea of open borders, of no checks, no social security numbers, no green cards, just anybody who wants can come into the country without the government checking at all.
Okay, so all these people would have to have green cards under your guys' system.
Yeah, of course. But the difference would be that, like, it would be way easier to get. So there's 13 million or so illegal immigrants here right now. They need a path to citizenship. Like, whatever dumb shit we're doing right now is a waste of time. They should be made citizens. And then if you want to move here and you have the means to do so, and you don't have like a disease or some pre-existing thing that would keep you out, like being part of a terrorist group or maybe like a member of a foreign army, like, you'd be allowed into the country basically.
Yeah, which again, compared to right now, would be comparably open next to what we've got now.
You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry. I wanted to clear up what you guys think of as nationalism. So what does nationalism mean to you if, you don't have a big dispute with us on borders, you're not open borders globalists? What is you guys' actual stance on nationalism?
Just to be clear real quick, I think we do have massive disputes on the border. So we're kind of equivocating on being like, we're both like, oh, well, there's different requirements. But it sounds to me like me and Basquiat would let far more people in than you guys would. Right. If the whole debate was literally just like, are you in favor of literally erasing the border off the map and letting someone come in and out? That's a little disappointing, because I don't think that's where most of the border disputes lie. I think it lies in who we let in. In terms
so you guys
of
aren't for the giant caravans of illegals necessarily.
Well, I mean, in our definition, they wouldn't be illegal, right? You probably get them to the border, process them, and let them into the country, right?
And so, things wouldn't happen the way they do now, because you would have an expectation that would be much easier to get in the United States. So you wouldn't have some of the madness that you have now, where maybe a large number of people will break through a fence or something. You wouldn't need that, because it would be much easier to get in legally.
And
so
go ahead.
I was just going to say, what's a nation to you guys then? If it's anybody can kind of come in, you do a quick check, but there's no real limit on how many or who or where from, other than you can't have a disease or be a terrorist.
In terms of what a nation is, so this is perspective that I have from my parents. My mom and dad used to be in the Air Force, and they told me that when they deployed to Okinawa, or when they go to places in Asia, that when they would step off base, they were in a whole other world. That's how different the world was back then. People today like to act like these solid, individual nations exist and they're totally separated, but I don't think that's true. So when you ask what is a nation, I mean, right now, roughly, it's just basically a set of borders that has one group of people that are governed by common laws, and that seems to be it. We get our production from other areas, we have citizens from other areas, we've got culture from other areas, we've got a whole bunch of other shit from other areas. I would challenge, or I would curious what you guys would consider what is a nation, or in your eyes, what would a nation be, and how much stuff would we have to get rid of or roll back to protect that idea of what a nation is to you?
To be clear, you're saying, Destiny, the big differentiating feature is the set of laws that the society
that's what makes
structured around. The border is effectively where one law ends and another begins.
You don't think that there's any culture at all, Destiny? You just think that it's just people who are inside the confines of lines?
Well, so to fast forward this argument a bit, I mean, because my standard response is I'm going to challenge you. Tell me what U.S. culture is. You're going to give me some vague answer, and then I'm going to say, tell me what's like the commonality between somebody that lives in a town in Alabama versus somebody that lives in San Francisco. And then I'm going to point to you that I can find more similarities between conservatives in Alabama and Saudi Arabia than I can between people in Alabama and San Francisco. Like,
but they don't look through the prism of the Constitution like the individuals in the United States do. That's one of the primary differences.
Say that again? Sorry.
One of the primary differences is that we're federalists, so we all look through the prism of the Constitution.
No, I don't think so.
I think so, and that's one of the most uniting features amongst Americans. It's one of the features that you don't see overseas. So you can make the comparison and say, well, the culture over here is actually more similar to the culture in Alabama, for instance, in a different country. You might be right, except they're not looking through the prism of the Constitution.
Can you answer me? How can you wait real quick? I'm just curious to answer this question. How can you tell me that we all look through the similar culture or through the similar prism of the Constitution, and then on the other breath, like tell me that liberals want to repeal the First Amendment or the Second Amendment, or that you like want to repeal like the 19th Amendment or something like that? Like clearly, we all view the Constitution in very different ways. As somebody that lives in California and can't buy any fun firearms, I can tell you that people here view the Constitution way differently.
That may be true, but you're still looking through the prism of the Constitution. Whether your interpretation of it is different from mine or not, we're still looking through the same prism.
But that's something that changes based on what side of the line you're on. But I mean, it's important to remember that on the other side of the line here in the United States and Canada, we have a country that is very similar in terms of it being a big federal continental country, democracy. It's a different kind of democracy, but in the end, it's not something that's so alien that it would be a major shift for somebody to switch countries. And in Mexico, it's the same thing. I mean, Mexico is suffering from a lot of crime and corruption right now, in part, perhaps large part thanks to our drug war. But in the end, it's still another democracy. It's a federal republic. The official name of the country is the United States of Mexico. It's a society that is not politically alien to the United States at all. In some ways, it may be closer in design. So it's not like these are alien, societies. They have a different constitution because they're on a different side of this line. But when you switch, you have a lot of the same sorts of expectations for rights and procedures
And you literally even have like sanctuary cities that reject like federal law and immigration, or you literally have states that are making things legal that are illegal on a federal level, like marijuana or gay marriage.
That's true, and that's due to the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment is absolutely something that you would be looking at if you were looking through the prism of the Constitution.
Well, but then you've basically made it so that can you give me an example of a view that might come into the United States then that wouldn't be through the prism of the Constitution? Because literally everything passes under that bar then.
Yeah, I don't know. Anybody who was after like Sharia law, let's say, or anybody who was after...
Wait, so Sharia law, so things like enshrining religious doctrine in our law? Because there's a lot of conservatives in the United States that want to do stuff like that, making like incest or sodomy illegal.
And we understand that, but let me finish my point. My point is that, of course, there's value structures that people can bring where they're not looking through the prism of the U.S. Constitution, absolutely, which is a pivotal part of our culture. That's just true. It just is.
You can't just say it is true.
Well, one of the things you'll find, right, is that if you talk to people abroad, one of the ways that they describe American culture is that they're very constitutional centric. Okay. Yeah, there's just so much that's not true about this. So as somebody that used to be a practicing Catholic, so when you say things like Sharia law, having this separate set of like rules and punishments or whatever, this exists in the Catholic Church. We call it reconciliation and contrition. You break a Catholic Church law and so are you telling me that no Catholic, like they literally look up to the Pope as their like spiritual leader, like more so than the President of the United States? So much so that it's caused issues in the past where people are worried about Catholic as a spiritual leader, but not as the physical leader of their nation.
But maybe not as a physical leader of their nation, but they definitely look to it for moral laws. You can have Sharia law that doesn't
Catholics divide themselves and also say that you can look at the Pope as a spiritual leader as the body of the church, but you can also reject what he says as not being canonical or not being correct. There's different rules of thought when it comes to Catholicism. I don't see what the hell that has to do with the fact that most Americans look through a constitutional lens, though.
Okay, that's all I wanted you to say. So earlier, I asked you what the unifying thing was about the United States, and you said it's the fact that all of us look through the constitutional lens, but now you've conceded to me that most people look through the constitutional lens.
That's a bunch of semantics.
Well, I'm curious. When you say most, are there some people then that are living in America that aren't American to you? Or what do you mean by that? I'll let you amend the statement. I'm trying to catch you.
People who live inside the United States who are not American, Destiny. Lots and lots.
So by what you just said, that most people look through a constitutional lens, can you give me an example of some of those that don't look through a constitutional lens that wouldn't qualify as being American to you?
No, well, I mean, they would still qualify as far as their citizenship goes, but that wouldn't
I'm
necessarily.
not asking about their citizenship. I'm saying in
wouldn't
Big Papa
necessarily
Fascist's
mean
eyes.
that they would be very well culturally integrated.
Well, but that's what I'm asking you, because I'm looking to you because you challenged me by saying there must be some common American culture, and then I asked you what that would mean.
That's the commonality in American culture. Now, you can't ascribe it to every single human being, but for the most part, you can ascribe it to most people. Yes.
Sure, but if there are people that fall outside of that, then my question is there just an atypical American experience? Because if you're going to grant me that, then I'm going to say, well, there might just be some immigrants that could come in and have an atypical American experience.
I'm sure that there could be.
Well,
Actually,
then what do we disagree
I
on?
could jump in here and help you guys. I think I could help you out here.
Sure.
So I'm glad that you all agree that there are different groups in the United States who, like you said, somebody in small town Alabama, what do they have in common with someone in San Francisco? This has been a struggle that Americans have had since, the beginning, since we got to be a pretty larger nation. It started as these Puritan, very religious Puritans, and 100 years later, it really wasn't like that anymore. And I think the whole point of this, the reason that Andy and I wanted to talk about nationalism is because we believe that if you don't have nationalist populism, there's a very good chance that this nation will end up balkanized, that it will not stay together, especially if you flood the country with immigrants. Nationalist populism is the thing that people can unite under, that urban blacks, that rural whites, that Asians in San Francisco, that Mexicans in Texas who are first generation immigrants can all unite under. If we don't have national populism, we do have a problem because of the fact that we don't organically have a very monocultured type of a society like maybe Sweden or Iceland or Japan would have.
I don't think anybody's advocating for a monoculture. In terms of what you mean by, maybe we should ask this, what's the difference between nationalism and patriotism? Or our side could define that, I guess, or you could define it, because we need to understand what we're talking about.
Well, I would say that patriotism is kind of a sentimental idea, whereas nationalism is it could be more of a policy driven type of a thing rather than just a sentimental idea, rather than just, we have people in the country right now where half of them think you should go to jail for burning the flag and the other half think that you should burn the flag. So if you had a more nationalistic type of a society, if you had the government promoting American nationalism, we're not saying monoculture. We're not, like I just said, we are not saying blacks in urban Atlanta need to be the same as me here in the rural Midwest. What we're saying is the one thing we can all unite under is a banner of nationalist populism. And it would be better to have that than to have balkanization or have people constantly infighting, which is what we experienced last year. We had constant infighting among groups.
The situation you described with balkanization, the United States, quote unquote, I guess balkanized, as they broke up one time over an economic issue, primarily economic. There's nothing of comparable gravity or regionalism in the United States today, and all the kinds of disparate or differences and situations, discord and disagreements that you've described here. There are no clean lines, no regionalism to match. There's no credible risk of the United States breaking up at all.
She didn't say that there. Listen to me.
And the idea that this is just going to happen, and therefore we need to have a nationalistic government.
That's not what she's
the idea
saying.
that this could happen. That was the reason why we need to have a government that promotes "quote unquote" American nationalism. And I know while you're apparently not talking about a monoculture, if you're talking about a government that promotes "quote unquote" nationalism, then presumably you're talking about a government that promotes certain policies designed to get more people behind a common set of experience and belief, which seems like the opposite thing you'd want to do if you'd want to preserve unity in a diverse continental-sized country.
Why? Why is that contrary? That makes no sense.
Because under our framework, this goes back to Federalist number 10, where Hamilton said, look, democracy in a big republic can work because all of these different interests can keep each other in check. Everybody has the opportunity to put their policy into practice, to have the ability to sort of have a corner of this great country where they can be themselves, as far as possible under our constitutional framework. Well, but the idea of trying to squeeze everybody into a narrower box...
Way to cherry pick federalism, but the thing is, Bastiat, is look, we all live under one federal government.
Right.
Everybody does. There's no particularly good reason why you can't promote nationalism, or the federal government cannot promote nationalism and make a strong state. There's no good reason why they can't do that. There's no good reason why they shouldn't do that.
I don't think either of us disagree.
What is nationalism and a strong state to you? Because the United States government is a pretty strong state.
How many times do you want this redefined?
Wait. First of all, the first definition was a little bit like unclear, which is fine. But so more concretely, I think what we would ask is like, what's an example of like a nationalistic policy?
A nationalistic policy at the federal government level, maybe you could look at infrastructure might be a nationalistic policy. You could look at maybe different economic incentives via taxation, things like that could be nationalistic policies. There's
basically the entire Trump and Pat Buchanan America First agenda. Yeah, those were both attempts to unite the different factions of the republic under a banner of nationalism. It's the way you overcome all of the racial differences and religious differences. It's the reason you can have a country with freedom of religion, with multiple cultures, with multiple races, because you can unite them under love of country and love of your nation. It doesn't, like he said, those two aren't mutually exclusive.
So like Thomas Jefferson said, we're all Republicans, we're all Federalists.
So I don't think either of us would disagree with either of that. But the weird thing, though, is that like everything you're giving me is like 100% not the Trump agenda and absolutely the Biden agenda. So when we look at, for instance, like infrastructure, that's what's working its way through Congress right now. There's a question of if any Republicans are going to be on board with that, the massive infrastructure. But when you talk about economic incentives, that's baked into the last coronavirus relief and potentially like the new infrastructure bill going forward. Like that's economic incentives that Biden has for working class families. When you talk about attempts to unite the republic, if you look at Biden's rhetoric, he's not a Republican or a Democratic president. He's the president of the entire United States. He's the president of every American. When you talk about a country with religious freedom, Trump is the one that's holding up the Bible and saying, this is my holy book. This is one of the best books ever written. I think it's my first favorite or second favorite behind my book or whatever, right? It feels like everything you're giving me right now is like 100%
None of
Biden's
that has
rhetoric.
anything to do with anything. Who cares if Biden has what you consider portions of a nationalistic agenda? Good. He also has portions of things that are not a nationalistic agenda, like what you guys consider open border immigration.
Well, what part of Trump
wants to move in?
What part of Trump was considered a nationalistic agenda? Was it the massive tax cuts for wealthy corporations?
How's this for a massive infrastructure project? The wall. That would have been a very highly nationalistic project. That's just one example among many.
You're a
level country here.
You're a real life.
Nothing of the sort. Go ahead.
Well, okay, I'm sorry. This is true. Yeah. You're a real life person. You drive to work. Okay.
Yeah.
I've driven all over this country for a long time, and I'm sorry, but the idea that investment of our infrastructure, as somebody that's driven on roads in the Midwest that are fucking falling apart, as somebody that wants to move to Miami where buildings are fucking collapsing, as somebody that is like watching flooding happening like around the world and shit, as somebody that is watching like the dramatic change in climate across the Northwest where they don't have air conditioners, because how are you telling me that a wall is the type of infrastructure investment that people across the country are looking forward to?
Whether you agree that the wall was a good idea or a bad idea is irrelevant. I was giving you an example of something that would be nationalistic. So when we're talking
hold on. We're asking you for examples. You can't give me an example, and then when I push back on why your example is dog shit, say, well, that's not relevant. It absolutely is relevant. You brought it up as an example.
Dog shit. What you're doing is saying, I don't agree with this example of nationalism, not saying that it's not an example of government nationalism.
Well, I've got two presidents. One president
is going to unite disparate people, though, not just something that 50% of the population is down with.
No, nationalistic
is going to unite the nation on a wide scale.
That's just bullshit, and he made it up. Nationalistic policy is not necessarily there to unite everybody.
Okay, you literally said, I'm writing these down. Hold on, I'm writing these down as you said them. You said united under love of country / nation. The wall was the most divisive thing. It even divided Republicans.
They can be, and policy on the national level can be divisive, like the coronavirus. Right now, you pushing vaccines pretty hard. That's a pretty divisive policy, but most certainly it's a nationalistic policy, and there's a lot of nationalistic propaganda around it, isn't there?
Let me ask you, what makes a policy nationalistic? Like, because if we're talking about the wall, for example, the wall is divisive. The wall comes with great. Let me just explain why I'm skeptical of this. Maybe we go to another policy. I don't know, but the wall is divisive. It comes at the expense of the taxpayer to the tune of several billions of dollars. The economic benefits are not there. It requires the use of eminent domain to take land from citizens that do not want to give it up. And when you're done with it, the wall
What
is something
would
that
make it
immigrants will be able to
nationalistic?
hop and break through. So it doesn't seem to provide any benefit.
So
of
what
any
would make
sort.
the
What
policy
makes it nationalistic?
What would make the policy nationalistic, to answer your question, would be that the federal government and the body of the government of elected officials are pushing it specifically for the purposes of benefiting its own people. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to benefit all of the people, or that it won't even be a divisive policy, but that doesn't mean that it's not a nationalistic policy.
You literally named this. Is every single policy.
Yeah, this is governments I'm really curious about this. I don't know what governments do that is not in the interest of their governments. Like when you say an America First policy, when does the United States government implement policy without, thinking this will benefit the United States in some way?
Well, I could tell you.
Right?
I could maybe clarify that for you. So when we're talking about nationalism, the things that Andrew and I don't like to see, the things that worry or concern us, because we have 5 children and we hope to have a lot of grandkids, and there's going to be a lot of Wilsons running around in the decades to come, we don't like to see things like transnational corporations, special interests, foreign nations coming in and having so much influence in government policy, in how things are done. And people who are fine with globalism and think that globalism is good, nationalism is some kind of tribal, racist, xenophobic thing. And globalism is the loving, accepting, nice thing. Have no problem with huge corporations coming in. You saw this again during coronavirus, where certain states would say, okay, we're going to lift this mask mandate. You don't have to have it anymore. And then all these giant mega corporations like Target or Home Depot or Walmart can say, well, we're going to still require it. We don't care about your state laws. Where tech corporations can decide they're going to silence people. And, Florida's trying to pass laws saying you can't exactly do that, kind of similar to what Poland did. We don't like undue international influence and foreign influence in our government. So that would be, I think, a point of disagreement we have with you guys. I think we all agree on infrastructure. We all agree on, you guys kind of conceded that you agree that we have to have some kind of a border, and we have to have some kind of qualifications. Maybe we disagree on what those would be, how many or whatever. But how do you guys feel about these giant international corporations having at least as much power as our government?
Just to be quick, we have absolutely not conceded on a single point. Firstly, secondly, we clearly don't agree on what infrastructure is. A wall on the border is not infrastructure. Like renovating our buildings, our bridges, our roads, our power plants, that's infrastructure.
Do buildings have walls, Destiny?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I guess it's part of infrastructure then.
If you have a useless if the government has built a useless object that benefits nobody, it doesn't.
How is it
The fact that it's built something does not make it infrastructure.
Just so real quick, and we might have differences of opinion
So I
on that.
guess
That's
at a
fine. Wait, real quick.
if there's a gate in front of the post office, that's not part of the infrastructure.
We might
right?
have differences on what infrastructure means. You can laugh all you want, but I don't think people think that just building a building makes it infrastructure. Usually when you're talking to Americans, especially working class Americans, the infrastructure that they're concerned with, like here in California, the stability of your power grid, or in Texas, people are aware of this, right? That's an infrastructure improvement.
If you're worried about the stability of your power grid, then you should want that wall built, because if you have a massive uncontrolled influx of people coming in that you don't even know how many there are, that's going to stress your power grid. So that wall would be very helpful.
I really look forward to the studies to come out showing that immigration is what causes our power grids to fail. I don't think that's the case, but regardless, I think that in investments and think that was your implication. In regardless of that, when we say investments in infrastructure, we're not just talking border walls or border security. This is like immigration policy. Okay, well, you can keep saying that you didn't say that you were, but every time I push you an example, you give me something that you want to retreat from as soon as I push you just a little bit on it. Number one. Number two, I would appreciate it if you stop saying, don't characterize our positions as attacking you for being tribal and racist and xenophobic. I don't believe either of us have said that. Nobody's talking about being tribal, racist, xenophobic. We're just talking about...
He literally said xenophobic.
He said xenophobic one time in his opening statement, sure, but we're not like sitting here attacking you that. We're going point by point over why we think your particular policies are bad. It's not just because they're xenophobic or just because we want to be tribalist or whatever. We just think these are bad policies. And then in terms of like and this is another thing that I get confused on in terms of trying to figure out like what is your concise position. So you say things like our common culture is looking through the prism of the Constitution, but then you seem to be upset when companies practice their First Amendment right to say remove people from their premises who don't wear masks, or say silence people on their private platforms if they deem that to be a thing. That these are all things that are protected by the First Amendment. And then you talk about like hating transnational corporations or foreign nations having interests, or like what? What do you mean by a transnational corporation? Are you just mad that any corporation is in another area?
Man,
or
that's
like,
a huge gish gallop. Just one point at a time. Let us take
okay,
it.
if you want to do real quick, if you want to do one point at a time, you can. But I'm just writing down everything you're saying and I'm responding to it. So if you're accusing me of gish galloping, the irony is I'm just responding to your point. So for me to gish gallop, you need to gish gallop first. I'm only responding to the things that you said directly. And there's even one point that I left off here about special interests that I didn't respond to. So I'm only responding to exactly what you're saying. If you want to go line by line, do it.
What do you want to know first?
How about that bit about the Constitution, where on the one hand you venerate it as an object that unites us, which sure, I agree with that, but then you were openly, repeatedly scornful
I didn't say
that basic constitutional
I didn't say
rights.
it was uniting necessarily. What I said is that as part of our culture, we look through it as a prism. Just like if you were a part of maybe a Christian culture, you'd look through the Bible as your prism. That's my overarching point. There is a commonality inside the American culture called the federal Constitution. Yes.
Well, but you realize that Christians inside the country that look through the lens of their religion before like any type of federal doctrine, like these people are literally practicing a form of Sharia law. Like that's what that means, right?
No, they keep them separate.
No, they don't. Sharia law literally is a separate doctrine.
I'm not talking about Sharia law. I was talking about Christians.
Okay, I'm sorry. That's my mistake. But earlier, you made a reference to the fact that people coming over practicing Sharia law would be an example of being un-American. And I'm telling you that there are groups of Christians in the United States that have their whole own separate set of like bylaws. And if you break them, here's the punishments. That's roughly what Sharia law is having your own set of rules and punishments that are separate from any federal or state system.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I think it's okay, but you said it wasn't okay. You made it sound like that made you un-American.
That is pretty un-American. I feel like it's such a non sequitur.
It's not I'm literally addressing the point you're exactly bringing up.
Like, look, there's Sharia law, right? And people who are practicing Sharia law, that's un-American because they're not practicing the Constitution. All I'm saying is that most Americans look through the prism of the Constitution as a uniter. That's all. Sure. Not saying that there's not other groups that don't do that inside of America, because there clearly are. I don't really see what you're saying has to do with what I'm saying.
Well, it's quite strange to. Okay. It's quite strange to talk about the prism of the Constitution. Anybody who finds themselves in some kind of legal jeopardy or is trying to interface with the government feels like they have been trampled upon is going to look through the prism of the Constitution as their first tool in their toolkit. I mean, communists, Nazis are facing some kind of federal oppression, even if their response, even if their deepest belief is to overthrow the government of the United States and shred our quote unquote antiquated Constitution. Of course, they're going to use the Constitution to protect themselves as far as possible. Everybody in this country does that so far as
that doesn't mean that they're looking through the prism of it just because they're protecting themselves.
What I'm saying is it's a natural thing. The incentive is there at the start. To the extent the Constitution benefits you, and it benefits most people who want to speak freely, carry weapons, on and on, all the rest of it. I mean, that incentive is there. You don't need to teach people to love the Constitution because they will appreciate that Constitution in all kinds of basic life situations involving the government. That just happens naturally.
Getting too caught up on this. You asked specifically for an example of something that I thought was unique amongst this culture that is not unique amongst other cultures. And what I told you is one of those things is looking through the prism of the Constitution. I don't think that is the crux of our argument at all. It was just an example to give you.
Sure. So real quick, the way that arguments work is typically you have a series of premises, and taken all together, these premises naturally lead into a conclusion. So we asked you for these kind of like general defining principles,
which I gave
them to it. Yeah, but they're kind of wishy-washy. So we didn't understand, or I didn't understand. So I just asked for like a couple examples. And every time we get an example, it seems like a poor example, and we push back on it, and then you get upset that we're pushing back on it. So you got upset that we pushed back on the wall. You're getting upset that we're pushing back on Christians practicing separate laws. You're not pushing back. You're abandoning your examples.
That's not infrastructure.
In the beginning of this debate, sure, but in the beginning of this debate, you literally got upset that I said that the only thing that separates one country from another is laws, and now you're telling me literally that the thing that makes us Americans is that we look through the Constitution.
No,
I don't actually know what your position is right now. I have no idea.
Saying that. I'm saying that that's one part of the culture, yes, and it's one of the uniting parts of the culture. And specifically, looking through the prism of the Constitution is part of the defining nature of Americans inside the United States.
Sure.
It's part of the culture. That's all I'm saying.
Do you agree? Do you understand how weak your argument looks when literally one of the things that we battle for the most over the presidential election cycle is to change the Constitution? That it is probably one of the like incredibly divisive things that Americans look at, where we're trying to constantly get the Constitution updated or amended. Look at the Texas abortion law going through.
So we're all looking through that prism then. Got it.
Well, by
the-
definition,
I think
anybody
he's making
participating in the American system is looking through the lens of the Constitution.
It's-
then.
it's- It sounds like what you're saying more is just sort of a broad appreciation for the idea of the Constitution, the idea of following processes,
Actually,
and rule of law. But the
you know what? I'm
Constitution
done.
itself.
I just realized Big Papa Fash just completely owned us in this debate by giving us the best argument. Technically, every single country that does business with the United States of America and every single person that wants to do business with the United States of America at some point is crossing some law that is granted to us by the Constitution, therefore meaning that the entire world is superseded by the U.S. Constitution, which actually means we're a globalist nation by your own fascist definition.
That makes no sense.
What part of that didn't make sense? And I can explain it for you.
You're saying that because other countries have to engage with our laws when we entreat with them, that means that the Constitution supersedes all of their own law?
Correct. You're saying that just because you have to engage
What?
with U.S. law when you're in the United States, that somehow the Constitution is your unifying rally cry. That must mean the same with every other country that does
You guys
business
are
with the United
just hung
States.
up. You're just hung up on the point where I gave you one
if I may-
example of a unifying prism that we have. That's it.
I know I'm not as aggressive as the rest of you guys here, but I just wanted to try to get this conversation back on track because BPF and Destiny have like a thing where they like to yell at each other. What I would like to talk about, if we're talking about nationalism, is things like undue global influence.
Okay.
The things that I have a problem with, the things that I don't want to see in my nation, and the reason I want to preserve my nation's sovereignty is because I don't want our policy being based on UN policy. I reject things like UN Agenda 2030. I reject things like free trade and NAFTA, things that are not in our national interest, but are instead in the interest of a global community. When you hear this rhetoric like this global citizen nonsense, when you see, huge transnational corporations, they're not American companies necessarily. They are global companies that take advantage of our Constitution and our free speech and things like that. They get courts to rule that their corporations are people and things like that. So we've got all of this undue international influence. We've got these entities like the World Health Organization and the United Nations making policy, and then our government just goes, okay, and adopts it. I would like to see national sovereignty restored. I think it's been taken away. I think it's been chipped away at to the point that it's practically meaningless at this point. And that was all done through Cold War propaganda and shit like that.
Right.
The
So
United
let's
States,
go back to
When
talking
you collaborate,
about national sovereignty.
when you collaborate with somebody to accomplish a shared task, are you giving up your individual agency by throwing in with somebody to achieve a shared objective?
Cooperation is not the same as
I mean,
adopting
what is NAFTA?
international policy.
Wait,
Well,
what is
the thing
NAFTA?
is,
What
though,
is
that
International laws and policy and say, well, it's, we're just that's not
Well,
cooperation.
here's the thing, though. Like, there is no entity that is forcing the United States to do this. No other entity, as Stalin said when the Pope, disagreed about something with him, he said, "Oh, that's very nice. How many divisions does the Pope have?" Right? Like, who is forcing the United States? At the end of the day, we have all the levers, all the guns, all the control over international
All the
finance. That's not to
lobbying.
say that the United States is
saying-
invincible,
It's
but
the
the idea
lobbying.
Why are you pretending that
by
massive?
someone else.
Why are you pretending that massive corporate lobbying isn't a huge factor in writing policy, Bastiat?
Okay. So
yeah,
look,
but wait, corporate lobbying, it could be American corporations.
right? Like,
I'm
that,
curious-
in
But it's
fact,
not.
one thing that's really strange is that it seems like you're saying that we trust American corporations more than foreign corporations, when in fact those foreign corporations at least provide a source of competition for your domestic corporations. In Canada, for example, they've got some relatively antiquated nationalist laws that are designed to keep out American providers of telecommunications. And as a result, their communication stuff is just way more expensive than it would otherwise be. It does benefit a certain domestic interest, but at the expense of the rest of the country. And by keeping out that American competition, and primarily what they're worried about, they have only made themselves poor in the process. So like they have aided inefficiency in their own country. They haven't done anything for their country in the process. And yet that sounds like the kind of, worry that you've got here. American corporation better than foreign corporation. No, what matters is what these corporations, how they're interfacing with our government and what kind of services and goods they're providing to people in this country. Whether they are based here or there is irrelevant. As the commies often say, capital has no country. And, it's true,
So to get this right, you think that foreign lobbying is fine?
Wait, what does foreign lobbying mean?
It means foreign nations and corporations lobbying our government with bribes, essentially.
So right now that's illegal. So I don't know what you're talking about.
Like, to the extent that there are lobbyists.
You don't know what I'm talking about, so it's illegal, so it doesn't happen.
Well, no, wait. I'm just saying it's ridiculous for you to take that's like, let's debate on what should we do differently going forward. Like, people should stop murdering each other. Okay, that's illegal. What is your prescription there? Like, foreign entities aren't allowed to lobby or bribe the government. So I don't know what you mean when you say, like, do you think that we're pro foreign nations lobbying the government in an illegal manner?
They legally are, and I'll give you the process for exactly how they legally are able to do this.
Yeah, tell us.
What happens is we send over billions or to the tune of trillions of dollars in foreign aid over X amount of time to various nations. Those various nations will trickle that down to corporations where perhaps there will be some board member who happens to be related to some politician here. They get a nice big fat cut of that. The politician here domestically doesn't give a shit. Why would they give a shit? It's not their money. This happens frequently and all the time. One example of that would have been Hunter Biden, for instance.
Okay, but this is something that is very different.
How did Hunter Biden influence? Hunter Biden isn't president. Hunter Biden isn't.
And then I'll kick it back.
Okay.
So what I'm saying to you specifically is that this happens all the time, and you have to literally have your head stuck in the fucking ground like an ostrich to pretend it doesn't.